There are places in history so drenched in blood, they were buried on purpose. You weren't supposed to find this, but now you have. They called her a widow, a devout Catholic, a respectable businesswoman. Guadalupe Bejarano walked the elegant halls of 1890s Mexico City like a woman carved from stone, sharp, polished, immovable. She had survived her husband. She had outlived her enemies. And behind her tightly drawn black veil, she had built something no one could see. Not a home, not a business, a system for pain. You see, history doesn't remember women like Guadalupe for what they truly were. It dresses them in mourning lace and calls their cruelty discipline. But what if I told you this wasn't just a story of one woman gone mad? What if Guadalupe Bejarano was the first crack in a much older wall, one that hides a truth few are willing to accept? The truth is this: power often hides behind piety, and institutions, be they churches, governments, or families, are the perfect camouflage for predators who understand how to weaponize respectability. Guadalupe didn't kill for pleasure. Not entirely. She killed because she had learned something about human nature, something most men spend their lives avoiding. Pain opens doors in the human mind that nothing else can, and once opened, those doors don't shut. This story isn't just about murder. It's about a method, a ritualized structure of control. Torture wasn't chaos in her world. It was architecture. Blueprinted, efficient, sacred, in a twisted way. The most terrifying part? She wasn't alone. Not then, not now. As you hear what follows, I want you to feel it, not just as a horror story, but as a warning, a blueprint of psychological dominance that still exists, behind corporations, behind governments, behind your own routines. Guadalupe was just a vessel for something older. You're about to walk through a door where you cannot close. Are you ready to see how evil institutionalizes itself? Behind manners, behind religion, behind every proper face you've ever trusted? Then stay close, because the veil is lifting, and what's underneath doesn't care if you're watching. It only cares that you obey. You ever wonder why the most brutal monsters wear the cleanest clothes? Guadalupe Bejarano wasn't some shadowy drifter or back-alley sadist. She was elite, respected. She dined with clergy. She hosted politicians. Her mansion on Tuba Street was lined with rosewood furniture and imported French wallpaper. Every corner whispering wealth. Every curtain hiding screams. The irony? The very society that feared disorder empowered her because she embodied their illusion of control. That illusion, that facade, was her armor, but also her weapon. Because nobody suspects the widow in black. Nobody questions the woman handing out alms at Sunday Mass. And while they were praising her dignity, Guadalupe was building her empire of pain underneath their very noses. She didn't work alone. Not exactly. Her son, Aurelio, pale as a ghost and trembling with opium dependence, lived above the chambers of torment, like a man trapped between floors of reality. He heard everything, the cries, the branding, the ritualized corrections she called training. And yet he said nothing. Why? Because fear is a language. One Guadalupe spoke fluently, but here's what most historians won't tell you, what they can't tell you. This wasn't just about domestic abuse. Guadalupe's methods mirrored something far more ancient. Her training chamber was designed like an old-world penitentiary. Cold stone, chains, iron implements, not improvised, planned. This woman had read manuals, studied medicine, applied pain, not as rage, but as a curriculum. Her victims were not random. They were selected. Chosen for their vulnerability, yes, but also their symbolic value. Young, poor, female, forgotten. Exactly the kind of human capital governments and elites have exploited for centuries. And that's the forbidden truth. Institutions always need suffering at the bottom to hold up the illusion at the top. Guadalupe just turned it into a private religion. What do you think happened to the girls who entered that mansion with their heads full of hope? Who knocked on the door because a priest said she could be trusted? They weren't just tortured, they were transformed. They were unwound like clocks. Their minds rebuilt to accept punishment as love, obedience as survival. The question is, why? Why build a cathedral of suffering in the heart of Mexico's most refined district? Because monsters don't live in caves anymore. They live in systems, in respectable addresses, in rituals we call professionalism, discipline, or patriotism. Guadalupe didn't create the system, she just mirrored it perfectly. The first girl who vanished beneath Guadalupe's roof was named Casimira Juarez. 16. Alone, hungry. She came from the mountains of Michoacan after her parents died in a cholera outbreak. Her only possession, a cloth bundle and a priest's letter. That letter was her ticket, her proof of innocence. It said Guadalupe would take care of her, that she would be safe. It was a lie. But Casimira didn't know that, not yet. Guadalupe smiled when she read the letter, not out of kindness, out of calculation. You see, predators don't pounce. They study, they observe, and then they condition. Guadalupe watched Casimira like a biologist watches a lab animal, tracking every hesitation, every apology, every flicker of fear. The girl's room was spotless. Crucifix above the bed, a wash basin, clean sheets, all the optics of morality. But behind that door, Casimira was entering a controlled psychological environment, what modern psychology would call a compliance chamber. You won't find that term in history books, but institutions use it all the time. Prisons, boarding schools, workplaces, places where obedience is forged through architecture and routine. The punishments began small. Stand here. Don't eat today. Do it again. Bleed on the stone? Now clean it, while apologizing. What did Casimira learn? That pain came without warning, that no amount of effort could earn love, that silence was safer than resistance. Guadalupe called it correction, but it wasn't. It was engineering. She was manufacturing submission. Casimira became a mirror, reflecting Guadalupe's every command, anticipating her moods, flinching before she spoke, not because she was weak, but because she was systematically disassembled. This is how real power works, not with noise, not with chaos, but with order that cuts like a scalpel. And Aurelio? He heard it all from the floors above. The screams, the sobs, the soft voice of his mother, whispering sacred punishments. He tried to escape with laudanum, but drugs don't silence truth. They just make it echo. In his journal, he wrote, "The girl cries at night, the way animals do, when they know no one's coming." But Aurelio wasn't the only one who remained silent. So did the city. So did the priests. So did the women who sipped chocolate in Guadalupe's parlor, never asking why she had so many new servants, and why none of them ever stayed. Casimira lasted 6 weeks. Then, one morning, there were no more screams, only silence. And a cart rolling down Tuba Street before dawn. Silence is the most powerful sound in a system built on obedience. When Casimira's voice disappeared, no alarms rang, no officials knocked, no clergy wept. In fact, her name vanished as easily as her body, erased by society's indifference and Guadalupe's precision. You see, this wasn't just murder. It was a ritual erasure, and the ritual had rules. Rule 1. Choose victims no one important will miss. Rule 2. Maintain public virtue. Rule 3. Blame the weak for their own suffering. Guadalupe didn't bury Casimira like a killer hides a body. She planted her, like a seed. The first offering to a larger idea, that beneath respectability lies a hunger for dominance, and that the powerless are the currency. She wrapped the body in old bedsheets, the same ones Casimira had been punished for soiling. Poetic. Then she carted her into the dark corners of Mexico City's growing edge, where the land was loose and the poor buried their own. No gravestone, no prayers, just dirt, just forgetting. But here's what matters. Guadalupe didn't feel guilt. She felt something worse. Completion. The system she built hadn't failed. It had worked perfectly. No suspicion, no witnesses, no inquiry. Casimira's death wasn't a mistake. It was proof of concept. That's when Guadalupe changed. She moved from impulse to process, from cruelty to craft. What followed was her professional phase. For a year, she wore virtue like a velvet cloak, donated to churches, hosted charity luncheons, expanded her domestic staffing business, offering girls from the countryside to the city's most powerful families. On the surface, a success story. Underneath, a supply chain. Each girl arrived alone. Each was isolated. Each was subjected to her training methods. But Guadalupe was careful. She alternated between candidates. Let weeks pass. Never too many at once. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was managing. Nung risk. And while she perfected her physical tools, chains, heat, restraint, it was her psychological techniques that became legendary. She learned how to pace the abuse, to give moments of reprieve, of false kindness, so that the punishments felt like falling from grace. This is how institutions condition loyalty. They make you blame yourself for every failure until you police your own thoughts. That's the horror. That pain, when delivered just right, doesn't provoke rebellion. It breeds devotion. The next girl was named Tomasa, 14, small bones, large eyes, no family, no resistance. She arrived on a Thursday. By Sunday, she was calling Guadalupe Madre. This wasn't love, it was survival. Guadalupe had mastered a truth darker than murder, that the deepest prisons aren't locked with keys. They're built from confusion and dependency. Tomasa's training began with silence. No speech allowed unless spoken to. Each word was weighed, each breath monitored. A spilled cup, a crooked button, a tremble, punishable offenses. But the punishments weren't just beatings. They were stories. Guadalupe would sit her girls down and tell them tales about orphans who disobeyed and ended up eaten by coyotes, about women who dared to speak out and were burned as witches. She'd whisper them in the dark, just before sleep, until reality and nightmare fused. This was indoctrination. It was psychological architecture. Guadalupe wasn't content with obedience. She wanted the girls to believe that suffering was their purpose, that she was their protector, that the outside world was far worse than anything inside her home. And it worked. Neighbors began noticing how disciplined her girls were, how polite, how grateful, how still. They praised Guadalupe's moral excellence, even invited her to lecture at women's societies on domestic virtue. She became a model citizen. But inside the walls of her home, new rituals had begun. Guadalupe kept notebooks, meticulously logged details on each girl, sleep patterns, reactions to stimuli, emotional cycles, breakpoints. She was no longer just training servants. She was conducting human experiments. And then, one night, Tomasa vanished. No funeral, no report, no search, and once again, the city exhaled like nothing had happened. But something had. Guadalupe had crossed a threshold. Her second kill was cleaner, quicker, more confident. This wasn't about rage. It was about control, refinement, the kind that institutions reward when carried out in labs or prisons. But this was happening in a house, in a city that claimed to care, in a system that punished only the poor for disappearing. By now, she understood something essential, that if no one protects the voiceless, you can become God. And once you taste that, you don't stop. You scale. Her third girl was named Estefania, 11 years old, found half asleep behind a butcher's stall, arms bruised from discipline at a Catholic orphanage. Guadalupe told the nuns she was a savior. She told Estefania she was her last chance. And Estefania believed her. Because when you've never known safety, even a cage with velvet curtains feels like home. But something shifted with Estefania. She was harder to break. When Guadalupe imposed silence, Estefania hummed. When punished, she stared, not in fear, but in understanding, like she saw something. It unsettled Guadalupe. So she tried something new. Love bombing, gifts, praise, baths with rose water, a silk dress meant for a woman twice her size. Estefania was paraded through the neighborhood like a trophy. Guadalupe boasted to everyone who would listen that she was raising this one right. But inside, Guadalupe seethed, because Estefania smiled, but never yielded. She thanked Guadalupe, she obeyed, she never cried, but she also never called her madre, and that was dangerous. Because Guadalupe's power didn't come from chains, it came from worship, from emotional dependence, from rewriting identity until her victims forgot they ever belonged to themselves. Estefania resisted that rewrite. And so, after exactly 33 days, she too vanished. Neighbors noticed this time. One asked where the girl had gone. Guadalupe didn't blink. Sent her to relatives in Veracruz. She smiled. Her behavior was unstable. The neighbor nodded. After all, Guadalupe was respected, a patron of the church, a woman of virtue. And deep down, the city didn't want the truth. Not about its heroes, not about its women, not about what evil looks like when it wears a rosary. Behind closed doors, Guadalupe documented everything. Estefania's resistance patterns, the failure of rewards, the limit of psychological coercion. She refined her methods again. No more silk dresses, no more affection. She would return to fear, because love, true love, was unpredictable, but terror was a science. And Guadalupe was building a laboratory in plain sight, not for medicine, but for obedience, control, and death. And the city was her blind assistant. The next child was different. A boy, 10 years old, dirty face, broken sandal, caught stealing a mango from the market. No one claimed him, no missing person report, no outcry. Guadalupe took him in. She called him Angel. And in a way, he was. Not an angel of peace, but of revelation. Because Angel wasn't just another victim, he was a mirror. He fought back, bit her hand, smashed a ceramic bowl. Once he even tried to run, made it all the way to the gate before the iron latch caught his ankle. Guadalupe was stunned. This one didn't fear her at all, and it terrified her. Because for the first time, she saw herself in the eyes of a child, and not the saintly image she told the world, but the monster that lived behind the veil. So she punished him not to teach, but to erase. Days without food, nights tied to the bedpost, long monologues about gratitude, divine order, and how no one would ever love him like she did. But Angel didn't break. He watched. He listened. He waited. And one night, when the rain drowned out the city's breath, he vanished. Guadalupe searched. For hours. Streets, alleys, rooftops. Nothing. Not a single footprint in the mud. No one had ever escaped before. She spiraled, stopped eating, burned all of Angel's drawings, repainted the guest room walls. Her notes became unhinged, scribbled phrases like, "I am God's test," and "They must love me or perish." 2 weeks later, a rumor spread. A child had shown up at the convent, barefoot, bleeding, raving about a woman who hunted angels. The nuns dismissed it. Another street orphan with stories. But one of them, an old sister who'd met Guadalupe once, locked her door that night. Because she knew. There was a reason Guadalupe Bejarano never aged in the public's eyes. It wasn't skincare. It was sacrifice. And somewhere in that old mansion with shuttered windows and locked doors, Mexico's first serial killer was perfecting her legacy. With no one watching, except us, it began to rot. Her world. The smell came first, faint at the baseboards, then stronger, like spoiled milk and copper. She told herself it was rats, but rats don't whisper at night. She boarded up Angel's room, nailed the windows shut, covered the mirror. Still, the stench deepened, not in the house, but in her mind. Her diary became frantic. The children cry at night, but their mouths don't move. He is still in the walls. He sees me. God is testing my patience with shadows. Guadalupe stopped bathing. Her fingers trembled as she mixed laudanum into her tea. She stared at the cellar door for hours, convinced it would open on its own. Because deep down, she knew. Angel had left something behind. Not just fear, but a crack in the myth of her sainthood. The neighbors began to whisper. Children passed by her home in silence. Even the vendors stopped knocking, except one. An old woman selling candles. She wore a red scarf and walked with a limp. She never spoke unless spoken to. But one evening, as Guadalupe bought her usual white wax bundle, the woman looked her straight in the eye and said, "He's not gone. He's waiting." Guadalupe froze. "How do you know about—" But the woman had already turned the corner. That night, the whispers in the walls turned to scratching, then pounding. She grabbed her lantern and descended into the cellar. Step by step, the light flickered, the air thickened, and when she reached the bottom, there were footprints in the dust, small, bare, fresh. Leading into the back room she hadn't opened in months. Guadalupe didn't scream. She smiled, because if he had returned, she could finally finish what she started and ensure that no child ever escaped her again. The cellar door creaked open. Darkness swallowed her lantern's flame, but she stepped in without hesitation, like returning to a memory. This was her sanctum. No prayers were whispered here. No saints adorned the walls. Only rusted tools, blood-stained cloth, and the lingering presence of what she'd once called work. On the far wall, shackled to an iron ring bolted into the stone, were the remnants, not of Angel, but of others. Tiny shoes, a broken doll, fingerprints scraped into the rock by desperate hands. They weren't ghosts. They were reminders, evidence of what she had become long before Angel ever screamed. Guadalupe knelt. She ran her hand along the stone, smiling as she traced the familiar grooves. This is where they learned to obey. Her voice was soft, reverent, like a mother reading a bedtime story. Behind her, something shifted, a breath, a whisper. She turned slowly, lantern shaking in her grasp. There, in the corner, stood a child, not flesh, but memory. Angel's hollow eyes stared into hers. No rage, no fear, just knowledge. She approached him. "Do you forgive me?" she whispered. The boy didn't speak, but the walls did. They shuddered, as if they too remembered, every scream, every final breath. Then the cellar filled with sound, dozens of voices, all small, all broken, crying out at once. Guadalupe didn't flinch. She laughed, because this wasn't punishment, this was power. And now, she was ready to begin again. The door slammed shut behind her, but Guadalupe didn't try to escape. She simply stood there, listening, until the echoes of the children's voices faded into a deafening silence. She emerged from the cellar, a new woman, pale, unblinking, and entirely convinced of her divine mission, not as a mother, not as a healer, but as a purifier. She walked barefoot through the streets of Chihuahua, whispering verses that didn't exist in any holy book. Her eyes were fixed on the sky, but her hands clutched a small, leather-bound notebook, her scripture filled with names. Names of children, names of sinners, names of those she believed needed to be erased. When she passed by, mothers pulled their children close. Vendors crossed themselves. Even the constables, men with guns, refused to meet her gaze. Because by now, they all knew. They knew what had happened to the foundlings. They knew who had dug shallow graves near the aqueduct. They knew Guadalupe was no longer simply mad. She was untouchable. No one dared arrest her. No one dared confront her, because those who tried disappeared. It wasn't long before whispers turned into legends. Some said she could call the dead. Others swore she spoke in tongues unknown to man. And yet, beneath the madness, there was method. Guadalupe moved with purpose. From orphanage to orphanage, she gathered the forgotten, those no one would miss, and brought them home. Not to love them, not to raise them, but to cleanse them. In her mind, every child was a vessel, and only pain could make them pure. The cellar was no longer a hiding place. It was a temple, and she was its high priestess. They came in quietly. The children. Some lured with sweet bread. Others promised warmth, stories, or a bed. And some, taken, dragged. None returned. Inside Guadalupe's crumbling home, silence was sacred, except in the cellar. There, the air shook with murmurs, chants, and cries that sounded neither human nor entirely of this world. She began each ritual the same way: a bowl of warm water, a bronze bell, and a child bound. She'd whisper to them, not words of comfort, but of cleansing. She believed each child carried a sickness, not one of the body, but of soul, a rot passed down by unworthy parents. Her purpose was to strip it away. That meant pain. That meant isolation. That meant purification through suffering. The children were told, "You are not being punished. You are being made worthy. And in her madness, Guadalupe believed she was saving them. At night, her neighbors would hear her humming lullabies beneath the floorboards, even as muffled cries leaked through the cracks. But no one knocked. No one came. She had become something more than a woman, a myth, a curse. One mother, desperate and broken, confronted her at dawn. "Where is my daughter?" she screamed. Guadalupe only smiled. "She is clean now. You should be proud." The woman fled and was never seen again. And so, the ledger grew, name by name, soul by soul, each one documented, numbered, until it no longer felt like killing. It felt like order. Guadalupe wasn't just taking lives. She was crafting a doctrine, one death at a time. Her name was Soledad. She was 9. And unlike the others, she wasn't taken. She walked into Guadalupe's home, alone, uninvited, unafraid. She had heard the rumors, of course. Every child had. But Soledad wasn't like other children. She didn't believe in monsters. She believed in truth, and she was desperate for it. Her mother had vanished the month before, last seen speaking to Guadalupe at the well. So Soledad came, not to plead, not to hide, but to witness. Guadalupe welcomed her with a strange calm, as if she'd been expecting her. "You're not like the others," she whispered, brushing the girl's hair with fingers that trembled like branches in a storm. Soledad didn't flinch. Guadalupe led her down to the cellar. Candles flickered. The bell rang. The ritual began. But something was wrong. Guadalupe couldn't look Soledad in the eyes. The usual trance didn't come. The words she chanted caught in her throat, because Soledad watched her, without fear, without tears, as if seeing through her, as if Guadalupe herself were the one being judged. In that moment, something inside Guadalupe fractured. Her hands shook, her breath shortened. And for the first time in years, she felt something alien. Doubt. She reached for her ledger, but found she couldn't write the girl's name, because Soledad had none of the rot, none of the corruption, only clarity. And Guadalupe, in her madness, realized, this one doesn't need to be cleansed. She released Soledad, whispered for her to run, to never return. But Soledad didn't flee. She walked out slowly, watching. And that gaze, calm, steady, almost pitying, would haunt Guadalupe more than any scream ever could. Because for the first time, she saw herself not as a purifier, but as a murderer. A lie in human skin. The whispers had turned to roars. By the time Soledad returned home, everything changed. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But she left something on the table. A small, blood-stained rosary wrapped in hair that wasn't hers. And that was enough. Enough for her uncle to believe. Enough for the church to panic. Enough for the town to awaken from its long, rotting sleep. The elders met that night in the chapel. Faces pale, voices shaking. No more denial. Just the unbearable truth. Guadalupe Bejarano had never stopped. The missing, the sick, the orphaned, they hadn't died of natural causes. They had vanished into her rituals, year after year. And now they had proof. A priest, 2 constables, and Soledad's uncle marched toward the Bejarano home before dawn. The village watched from behind curtains, too afraid to follow. They found the door unlocked. Inside, the house was silent, but not empty. The priest led a prayer. The constables drew their weapons. Then, down the stairs, into the darkness. The cellar was colder than it should have been. The smell of wax, iron, and something deeper. The priest lit a candle, and what it revealed shattered them. Bones. Hundreds. symbols carved into every inch of stone, names etched into a blood-soaked wall, each one a ghost they had buried with lies. But the worst came last. A wooden table, stained black, still warm, and a ledger, open to a blank page, a pen beside it. But no sign of Guadalupe. She had vanished. No footprints, no trail, just one final inscription scratched onto the wall. I never killed the innocent, only those the world forgot. The priest collapsed in tears. The constables couldn't speak, and Soledad's uncle, he took the ledger and set it ablaze. But the fire didn't erase the guilt. It only made the town feel what Guadalupe had always felt, that some stains don't wash out, they burn. It should have ended in that cellar. But darkness like hers doesn't stay buried. It spreads. The whispers crossed rivers, borders, and languages. Within weeks, stories of the Witch of Guanajuato surfaced in newspapers, each one more grotesque than the last. Woman butchers 43 in ritual slayings. Serial killer escapes through wall of flame. Satan's midwife, Guadalupe Bejarano. None of them told the truth. None of them understood what had really happened. But the name was enough. And the pilgrims began to arrive. Not the holy kind. These were men in coats, doctors with shaking hands, occultists, aristocrats from France, even American agents with silver briefcases. They came to see the cellar, to collect her ashes, to buy what was left of her tools, her texts, her blood. The church refused, at first, but greed finds a way. And when the offers came in thousands of pesos, the clergy made quiet deals behind closed doors. One item at a time, Guadalupe's legacy was sold. Her books disappeared into libraries that don't exist on maps. Her bone-carved pendulum ended up in the collection of a wealthy British lord, who, not long after, hung himself from it. And that ledger they thought was destroyed? It resurfaced in a Manhattan auction house 2 years later. Unburned, untouched, open to a fresh page with a new name written. Who added it? No one could explain. But the deaths began again. Different town, same signs, same ritual, same cruelty. It was as if someone, or something, had picked up where Guadalupe left off, a darkness that didn't die, just changed hands. And the people of Guanajuato? They stopped speaking her name, tore down her house, salted the ground, built a school on the site. But every few years, a child disappears, and the teachers pretend not to hear the scratching from below the classroom floors. Some legacies are inherited by blood, others by belief. It was 1974 when Emilio Vargas, a young journalist from Mexico City, arrived in Guanajuato. He didn't believe in curses. He didn't believe in witches. But he believed in stories. And Guadalupe Bejarano's legend was too strange to ignore. He started with public records, found nothing, local interviews, stonewalled. The townspeople refused to talk. Old women crossed themselves at her name. Children whispered about blood beneath the school floors. Even the priests turned him away. But curiosity is a kind of hunger, and Emilio couldn't stop eating. One night, a retired gravedigger took pity on him. Drunk on mezcal, the old man muttered, "She didn't kill alone. She wasn't the first, and she's not the last." Then handed Emilio a single key, rusted, black, and cold as bone. "Cellar, beneath the school. Don't go alone." He didn't listen. At midnight, Emilio broke into the school. The halls groaned, the crucifixes all tilted slightly left, and in the basement, he found the door. That key? It fit perfectly. The room was silent, but not empty. There were symbols on the walls, painted in something that hadn't dried, a child's shoe, a rib cage buried in the dirt, and a book just sitting there, open, as if someone had been reading it moments before. The pages pulsed with heat. The ink smelled of iron and flowers. And then he heard breathing behind him. But when he turned, nothing. He ran, left the key, left the book, left the town forever. But the nightmares followed him. For 9 years, Emilio drew the same symbols over and over in his sleep. He never published the story. He never wrote again. He died in 1985, eyes gouged, mouth stuffed with pages from a burned manuscript. And that manuscript never found. Some say it was Guadalupe's final work. Others say it was his confession. But those who've studied the case agree on one thing. Whatever Emilio saw that night wasn't meant for human eyes. The school was quietly shut down in 1986. Officially, structural damage. Unofficially, too many students stopped speaking. Literally, just stopped. One by one, children began showing signs of what doctors called catatonic withdrawal. No injuries, no disease. Just eyes wide open, lips sealed, bodies frozen in the fetal position. They all sat facing the same direction, towards the old cellar. By 1987, the Mexican government sent in a covert investigative unit, 6 agents under the Ministry of Cultural Preservation, but backed by Federal Protection Services. Their mission? Assess and recover any historical artifacts of national significance. But they never made a report. All 6 agents disappeared. No bodies, no calls, just a single radio transmission on the final night. She's not a myth. She's waiting. And she's not alone. The next day, the entire school was bulldozed, concrete poured over the lot, and a military-grade radio jammer installed nearby. Locals say you still can't get a signal within 100 meters. But here's the thing. An independent researcher named Dartula Espinoza had bugged the site weeks before the demolition. She captured 48 hours of strange audio, chants in Nahuatl, a language no one at the site spoke, a heartbeat, slow but constant. And at 3:07 a.m., the scream of a child, followed by laughter. Only one phrase repeated clearly across all recordings. Ella todavía vive. She still lives. Dr. Espinoza's tapes were confiscated. She was silenced. Her colleagues claim she was relocated, but her brother leaked one note from her final journal. Guadalupe Bejarano wasn't just a killer. She was a conduit, a vessel for something that predated Mexico, and it's still here, watching, learning, growing. Some believe the government covered it up to protect the public. Others believe they're protecting something else. Her name was Luz Bejarano, a quiet art student from Guadalajara. She'd never heard of Guadalupe, never visited Guanajuato, never once questioned the strange scar she was born with, shaped like an old Spanish key across her spine, until she got the scholarship. It was a full ride, awarded by a foundation she'd never applied to. La Fundación de las Hijas Silenciadas, the foundation of the silenced daughters. The only requirement? She had to study abandoned architecture in central Mexico. When Luz arrived in Guanajuato, something shifted. Locals stared. Dogs barked at her. She began sketching the same building every night in her dreams, a stone mansion with no doors. One morning, she woke with dirt under her nails and her hands stained red. There was no memory, no wound, just a whisper in her ear. Welcome home, hija mía. In the following days, Luz was drawn to an overgrown path at the city's edge. It led to a gated hill, where wildflowers refused to grow. There, beneath the foundation of an old colonial ruin, she discovered something buried. A silver hand mirror, cracked, stained, and engraved with one word, Guadalupe. When she looked into the glass, her reflection didn't match her movements. It blinked when she didn't, smiled when she was afraid, and then it whispered in perfect Nahuatl, "You are me now." That night, Luz woke in the cellar of the old school, even though the building had been destroyed 40 years ago. The floor was wet with blood, the walls pulsed, and standing across from her was herself, or rather, a version of her wearing 19th century clothes and holding a knife. "The work is not finished," the reflection said, "and blood remembers blood." She tried to run, but the hallway bent in impossible ways, each door opening to the same room, the same stone table, the same mirror. Luz screamed, but her voice echoed back with a different accent. Older, colder, crueler. "You've returned, Guadalupe. Stop pretending to be Luz." She fell to her knees. She wasn't Guadalupe. She had memories, friends, a life. But when she reached into her pocket, there was no phone, only a yellowed envelope sealed in wax, with the emblem of a coiled serpent devouring a girl's face. Inside, a list of 43 names, each one crossed out in blood-red ink. At the very bottom, Guadalupe Bejarano, her own name. But then, another name flickered beneath it, only visible under the trembling candlelight. Guadalupe Bejarano. That's when it hit her. Luz wasn't just a descendant. She was the final echo of Guadalupe, reborn, rebuilt, reprogrammed. The dreams, the scholarship, the mirror, none of it was random. It was a summoning, an ancient ritual Guadalupe had crafted before her death, a way to pass her consciousness forward, life after life, through bloodlines and memory suppression. But something had gone wrong this time. Luz had resisted. The mirror cracked when she touched it. The voices stuttered. And somewhere in the house, another Luz was crying. A child version. Forgotten. She followed the sound, into the walls, into the dark. And there, buried beneath rotted floorboards, she found a child-sized skeleton holding a rosary. The exact rosary Luz had worn every day since childhood. It wasn't a family heirloom. It was a tether. A piece of Guadalupe's original soul, anchoring Luz in place. And then came the voice again, this time from inside her skull. "You broke the cycle, but you won't escape the reckoning." Because the mirror wasn't just a portal. It was a womb, and something was trying to be born. The floorboards groaned as Luz clutched the skeletal remains of her younger self. But the moment her fingers grazed the rosary, everything snapped. The house didn't crumble. Time did. Luz was no longer in 2025. The wallpaper peeled itself backward into the 1890s, the walls exhaling soot and candle smoke. She stood in the original Bejarano home, where Guadalupe had committed her first kill. A baby wailed in the corner. A man, bound, gagged, and weeping, knelt before a 16-year-old girl with ink-black eyes. Guadalupe. But this time, Guadalupe turned and saw Luz. "You're early," she whispered. "I was expecting you on my death day." Luz shook. "You're not real." "Neither are you," Guadalupe said calmly. "You're a blueprint, a failed experiment, but useful." Guadalupe stepped forward and placed a rusted knife into Luz's palm. The blade thrummed with ancestral rage. "You want freedom? Finish what I started." Suddenly, Luz was surrounded by shadows, victims past and future, their faces familiar. Her teachers, her childhood friends, a man she once loved, each one waiting for her decision. "Kill him," Guadalupe said, "and the curse ends." But Luz stepped back. She wasn't here to kill. She was here to break Guadalupe's cycle. And that's when she heard it again. A heartbeat. 2 heartbeats. 3. The mirror on the wall flickered, and in it, she saw herself, Guadalupe, and something else. A child with glowing eyes, trapped between timelines. The true anchor. A child Guadalupe had sacrificed long ago. Her firstborn, her soul's original tether. "Free the child," Luz realized, "and I destroy you." But the room began to warp, Guadalupe's face melting, her voice becoming monstrous. "You wouldn't dare." Luz ran toward the mirror, knife in hand. She didn't stab Guadalupe. She stabbed the mirror, right at the child's reflection. The glass shattered into blood and flame, and for the first time in over a century, the crying stopped. The flames died down, the screams faded, and Luz opened her eyes to silence. She was back in the house, her present day. But something had shifted. The stench of rot was gone. The walls no longer bled. The curse had unraveled. But Luz wasn't alone. At the center of the room stood the child, no longer glowing, no longer trapped, just a small boy clutching a rosary. He looked up at her with hollow eyes and whispered, "Thank you." He vanished like dust in sunlight, and then Luz saw it. The family tree etched into the wall had withered. Every name linked to Guadalupe Bejarano faded into the plaster, including her own. She was being erased. "No legacy," she murmured. "No more blood." As the house crumbled, Luz smiled. Her body dissolved, not into death, but into freedom. No more nightmares. No more echoes of screams. Just peace. But in a government archive in Mexico City, a historian unsealed a forbidden folder labeled Case B001, Bejarano Lineage. Inside were sketches, journal entries, and one chilling photo, a woman standing in flames, holding a mirror, with a shadow smiling behind her. The historian frowned. This wasn't in the official records. And far away, in a foster home outside Guanajuato, a little girl woke up screaming. She said her name was Luz, and she remembered everything.